Hello and welcome everyone to AFSC's Community Safety Beyond Policing webinar. If you're here for Understanding Copaganda, then you are in the right place. While you're settling in, please go ahead and pop your name, pronouns, and location into the chat so we can see where you're coming in from. For those of you who might be interested in closed captioning, we do have that available today. You can click the button at the bottom that says CC Live Transcript, and it's going to be a button at the bottom of the Zoom window if you want closed captioning. We do have, as always, our amazing tech support Summer here today. If you run into any tech issues, you can always try dropping and rejoining the Zoom, or you can send a message to tech support, Summer, and Summer will be able to hook you right up. So again, welcome everyone to AFSC's Community Safety Beyond Policing webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding Copaganda. And if you have any closed captioning desires, we have that enabled. Look at that CC Live Transcript button at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. Any tech support issues, use the chat. You can always send a direct message to Summer. She's listed as tech support, Summer. So thank you everyone for joining and telling us where you're coming in from. I see Pennsylvania, Seattle, Brooklyn, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Thank you all for being here tonight. To kick us off, we wanted to do a quick little poll to gauge where we're coming from. So I'm going to just you'll see a poll pop up on your screen. And we want to know, do you know what Copaganda is? Do you know how to recognize Copaganda when you see it? So any answer is correct. Please go ahead and answer that. And once it's answered, we hope that you'll also share a little bit in the chat about sources of Copaganda. So what are some places where you have seen Copaganda? What are some sources that you recognize as Copaganda? So once you've got that poll answered, if you can start dropping into the chat ideas of places that you have seen Copaganda. All right, Santa Monica and Lansing, welcome. All right, and Mary, I actually don't know how to share the poll results, so I don't know if there's a way for me to do this.
You do. Everybody can see them, actually, and we're still let's give it another second because people are still coming in. They can jump in and do the poll, and I think everybody can see the results.
All right, well then, welcome to those who are coming in right now. You are at AFSC's Community Safety Beyond Policing webinar on understanding Copaganda, and we do have closed captioning available. Look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see a little button that says CC and the words live transcript underneath it. If you click on it, that should give you the closed captioning. If you run into any tech issues, reach out to our amazing tech person, Summer. You can see her in the chat as tech support, Summer. And if you're just go ahead, Mary.
Go ahead. Sorry. No, I was just gonna say, hey, if you're just coming in, take our poll. We could see a few people have taken it, but would love to see more responses just to get a sense of where people are at as we begin our discussion of Copaganda tonight.
And I see some ideas around sources of Copaganda. We see mainstream media, any press releases that just reprint what the police say as if they're facts. Bill Horan has recognized Mary's little picture up here on the screen and points out that every single TV cop show is Copaganda. So thank you for popping these in.
So, Summer, I saw the poll answers and then it seemed like it changed. Did something happen?
Yeah, I shared it out, but then I reopened it since you wanted more people to be able to get their answers.
Okay.
So for cool. Folks to submit again if they'd like, or new folks to submit.
I see. Great. Well, did we notice any trends? It seemed like a lot of people felt like they knew what Copaganda was, but maybe were less sure about when they were able to see it. So that's perfect because we're going to talk about that tonight. Yeah, so should we move forward with the program, Jen? What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Let's go ahead.
Great. So I'm Mary Zirkle from American Friends Service Committee, along with my colleagues Jennifer too. Here we'll be moderating this evening, and we're both part of the Community Safety Beyond Policing initiative of AFSC. And over the last I guess about 2 years, we have been working together, colleagues from AFSC across the country, West Virginia, New Orleans, Chicago, Bay Area, New York, really all over the country, pulling together these regular webinars that are really trying to bring together organizers and community members to talk about all different aspects of how we can be building a world beyond policing, and our communities to be safe without policing, and really creating a system where everybody can feel safe. And so we've talked about things like getting police out of schools, policing and white supremacy, policing poverty, alternatives to 911. And so we encourage you, and you can see up on the screen our website, to take a look at some of those older webinars. We've also been doing study cohorts to dig deeper into some other subjects, and we'll tell you more about that at the end. But I know some of you come to a lot of these webinars, but just wanted to give a little bit of overview in case we have some new folks tonight. And we're really excited to have some great speakers with us this evening. Actually, I'm going to stop my screen sharing now because Palika's going to share some slides, I think. So yeah, I'm just going to introduce our first speaker, who's got an exciting presentation for us. We're going to have 3 speakers tonight, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So really excited that Palika Makam is here with us this evening. She is a digital organizer and storyteller based in Brooklyn, New York. And for the past decade, she's been using digital organizing, video, and ethical storytelling to advocate for change within the criminal legal system, specifically around police violence, immigration, and the prison system. She's been training communities across the globe, from Ferguson to South Africa to Palestine, to use video and narratives to expose police violence, advocate for immigrant rights, and to help people get out of prison or parole and clemency. It's really exciting work. Palika is currently the director of digital organizing at the 8th Amendment Project, where she's fighting to abolish the death penalty and other forms of carceral harm, like life without parole, and working to imagine a world more rooted in people, not punishment. And you can read and watch her work, like How to Film the Police in a Safe and Ethical Way, in publications like Teen Vogue, which is where we found her, and Vice and Elle Magazine and more. So really excited to have you with us tonight, Palika. So go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Thank you, Mary. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Big fan of this series, so I'm excited to be presenting on it. I'm going to share my screen. Get started. Let me know, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, and only my screen and not my notes. Love to hear it. So I'm Palika, thrilled to be here with y'all talking about Copaganda. It's a very exciting topic for me, so I'm excited that we're exploring it today. So I'm going to start off today with an exercise. Indulge me if you can. Close your eyes if you'd like to, and I'm going to give you a little prompt. So I want folks to think with me about a time when you felt safe, when you felt cared for, and when you felt content. So try to think about, where are you? Who do you see? What can you hear, smell, taste? Maybe there's a family member with you, or a teacher, or a friend. Maybe you're in your childhood bedroom, you're in your homeland, you're in your current house. So I welcome folks to kind of keep thinking about that place, but you can also open your eyes as I continue to speak. But for me personally, I see when I do this exercise, I see my partner, I see my mom, I see my grandparents. I'm in my grandpa's garden in India, in the southern part of India. I'm surrounded by jasmine and coconuts, and we're having, hot masala chai, and I'm surrounded by neighbors I've known my whole life, by plants I've known my whole life, trees I've known my whole life, and I feel full. My heart feels full, my belly feels full, I feel safe, I feel cared for, and I feel content. So I've done this exercise or something similar to it, either participated in it or facilitated it many, many times over the years with many people from many different places, not always people in the social justice space. And I will tell you that never, ever, ever has anyone ever offered an image of safety that included a police officer, a prison cell, a security guard, a weapon, or anything of that sort. People usually focus on images of safety that evoke feelings of abundance, of joy, of their needs being met, a family, of loved ones. But somehow we still have this societal connection between safety and policing. And part of the reason for that is because this pervasive narrative, the pervasive nature of this narrative within pop culture and within the media, and the different narratives that we consume. So I offer this exercise to people as someone who has been, deeply invested in the past decade of my career, in how visuals and narratives actually inform the policies, practice, behaviors, and laws that shape oppressive and carceral systems. So much of my work as a digital organizer and a strategist over the last decade has been focused on how these stories that we consume both, reinforce and lay the foundation for us accepting state-sanctioned violence, but also how we can reframe these stories and narratives to advocate for a country that is more ethical, more just, more focused on people and less on punishment and violence. So I ask folks to kind of hold that image of safety, whatever it was, in your mind as we go through today's presentation. And if folks are curious, this is my grandfather in his garden. This is my safe place, and it's a beautiful place. So what is Copaganda? Copaganda is the phenomenon in which news and media and other societal institutions, social institutions, promote celebratory portrayals of police officers with the intent of swaying public opinion for the benefit of police departments and law enforcement. So this is kind of the more traditional formal definition of Copaganda. I would add to this definition that with cell phone footage and the democratization of video production, Copaganda no longer just shows up on our TV and our movie screens and television screens. It's also online, it's on social media, it's on TikTok, it's on your cell phone. It can be created by police and departments really easily. And today I'm going to be talking about both Copaganda in the form of TV, movies, and then videos that go viral online. As folks shared in the chat, there's, lots of different forms of Copaganda. Those are the two that I'm going to touch on. And the latter, the sort of informal Copaganda, what you see on social media, what goes viral on social media, that's been really what I've been interested in understanding and learning in my work and how to resist that. So still, one of the biggest ways that Copaganda shows up in our lives is through TV and movies. Our screens are constantly filled with these heroic depictions of cops. You'll even see Black cops, liberal cops. You'll see cops who will work outside the system when the situation calls for it and do anything they can to secure justice, et cetera, et cetera. These shows are shaped by our beliefs about the police, but I'd even argue further that they shape our beliefs about the police even more. And even though they don't reflect the reality of policing, even when we live in a country where, or in a society where cell phone documentation of that reality is readily available. And this doesn't just happen by chance. Police officers and departments have put in decades of work to become those heroes that we see on our TV screens. So in 1951, a show called Dragnet, that's the image in the center. I wasn't familiar with it until I was doing a little research, but apparently wildly popular. It appeared in 1951, and the show was very much kind of like the result of a relationship between Hollywood and the LAPD. In fact, the LAPD's Public Information Division would review every script before it aired, and they had the chance to actually disapprove of any element of the show, and if they disapproved of it, it would be scrapped. So the same year that Dragnet premiered, there was actually a huge case where multiple members of the LAPD assaulted 7 civilians, leaving 5 Latinx men, including a couple other people, hospitalized, broken bones, ruptured organs. And we know today that racially motivated violence against civilians was and still is the reality of the LAPD. But night after night, people saw this different narrative on television. The show was a huge hit, and it really paved the way for other law enforcement departments across the country to work with TV producers, to work with people in Hollywood, to produce more shows. And today it is pretty standard for cop shows to have cop experts as consultants. And then today there is, of course, Law and Order, dun dun dun, and it's millions of spinoffs that not only portray cops and prosecutors as heroes, but also portrays public defenders as utter total trash and a huge obstacle to the criminal justice system. The show's creator, Dick Wolf, is a pretty loud and proud pro-cop advocate. Police departments have even been reported as watching these shows for training purposes, which is deeply disturbing and concerning. And I think just kind of speaks to how enmeshed these shows have become in our lives, so much to the point that police officers can't untangle the show from reality. I will say that after 2020, after George Floyd protests, some of these shows did and have tried to tackle racial justice storylines and police violence and corruption storylines, but they're kind of like a blip in this otherwise formulaic strategy, which has worked for years for them. So there are groups like Color Change, where I used to work and lead criminal justice and democracy campaigns. And these groups are, sort of tracking these things and calling for solutions to this problem. Some of the solutions that they're calling for is having more Black and brown writers in the room, having racial justice consultants, similar to how cop shows will have police consultants. So a couple years ago, the organization produced a pretty extensive research report that I have up here on the screen that actually looked at the role of crime dramas in advancing these distorted misrepresentations of crime and justice and race. And the results were pretty damning. They all just pointed to a culture of normalizing systemic violence and injustice from the police, and showing police misconduct in a way that even when you saw problematic characters, even when you saw those quote unquote bad apples and you knew that they were engaging in misconduct, it seemed justified. It seemed okay, because these characters are our protagonists. They are our heroes. And our heroes are allowed to mess up. They have backstories. They have personal stories. We're invested in them. We're invested in their motivations, their intentions, and no one else. It's just a quote from the report that I thought really stood out. And then, like I mentioned, Copaganda isn't just coming from these highly produced TV shows anymore. It's also on our cell phones. So coming out of 2020 and, the uprising for Black lives and protests against police violence, we were again seeing in real time just how critical video documentation was in exposing law enforcement, both at the state and federal level. But then we also saw how it was crucial in combating, false reports about protesters and other victims of police violence. But in the same way that folks were using cell phone cameras and videos online to, share truth, to kind of be this like layer of protection, police departments were also using those tools to depict themselves as like these kind, heroic, IRL loving community members who, had big hearts and could be the antidote to the actions of a few bad apples, like the police officers involved with George Floyd. So I'm going to share a few of many examples out there, but there were a ton that came out, especially during 2020. This is a screenshot from the Metro Nashville Police Department. They released a viral country music video. You can watch it on YouTube, it's still up, where you see the sergeant like singing with his guitar. There's people of every color who are, have signs that read like peace and united we stand, divided we fall. He's holding a sign up himself at some point. There were viral images of police officers posing with Black children, holding up Black Lives Matter signs at protests that they're policing. Or I remember there were pictures that went viral of police officers on Instagram opening up all their thank you mail that they claimed they were getting from the community. And a couple of these actually got debunked, that it wasn't actually real mail that they were opening. Images of police officers kneeling with protesters, hugging protesters, offering them snacks. Images and videos of police officers, crying to little Black children, but you can see the children are like visibly shaking and crying with fear from this interaction, but it's still being filmed and shared. These are a form of Copaganda, and a really dangerous form of Copaganda, because it gives the illusion that because this is unscripted, because this is on a cell phone, this is reality, that this is how cops behave. And if we promote this, we can get past the few bad apples instead of diving into systemic injustice. But what was the reality? When we watch these videos, I think it's important to remember, I think it's important to watch them with a lens of reality. So each of those police officers also has a gun. They have weapons. It's an asymmetrical power structure to begin with because of the physicality of it. They also, among other things, hold something called qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that effectively shields them from accountability for misconduct and excessive force. For example, folks might remember the Ohio dancing cop. He was a white police officer who went viral in 2015. There's a video where he's like seen stopping by, like the front yard of a few children, like young Black children are playing in the front yard. He stops by with them, he dances with them, went viral, people loved it. Well, in 2019, body camera footage surfaced of that same police officer punching a Black man in the face, doing some violent things. I'm not going to share that imagery. It was completely unprovoked, of course. And of course, that officer was eventually cleared, just showing like how those asymmetrical power structures show up. And because we have access to so much cell phone footage from 2020, we also saw numerous examples around the country, where police officers were filmed kneeling with protesters 1 minute and then would be abusing or like disregarding their constitutional rights the next. A demonstrator in Orlando shared this image of officers praying with protesters with the text, literally 45 minutes later, members of the department maced us in the face for the crime of standing in their vicinity. Another protester in New York tweeted a video of a police officer taking a knee with the text, "They beat the living shit out of us 1 hour after this." And both of those accounts have been verified. And I think the one that really stands out to me from summer 2020 was there was all of these videos of the highest ranking uniformed NYPD officer seen on his knees, like linking arms with protesters in the street. And then just an hour later, he and his department were seen kettling crowds, beating protesters with batons, pepper spraying demonstrators across the city. And it ended up being one of the most violent nights during that summer. So there's clearly, some sort of distortion between video and reality, which leads us to ask, are these officers really standing in solidarity with Black lives, or are they engaging in performative displays that subdue the public, aka Copaganda? But before I wrap up, because I always like to leave folks with some solutions, I want to end my section with what can we do to resist some of this propaganda, especially the type that goes viral because everyday people share it on social media. It feels like we have some influence there. And, I will just say that, like, I understand why people gravitate towards propaganda. It's in our nature to be hopeful, but I think it's important to understand when that need for positivity becomes harmful, because the reality is that no number of videos showing police officers conveying basic human decency is going to address systemic police violence. They just can't. So I would encourage folks that instead of sharing propaganda videos to foster hope, we should reframe what hope looks like. What if we shared images of volunteer street medics that were, treating and supporting injured protesters? Or what if we share photos and videos of all of the, from some of the various mutual aid groups that have popped up across the country who are, helping to fill gaps in our country's healthcare and food systems. And I think in addition to thinking critically about the TV we consume, we also have a responsibility in shaping how narratives are remembered and in shaping who we decide are our heroes, which is exciting. We have a role we can play. There's an intervention that we can make here. And, the videos and the images that get shared during protests and other times, they really shape how history is told. So I would encourage people to remember that the movement is not fighting for more cops, not even nice cops, but rather real investment in community-led and community-centered solutions to health and safety. So I'm going to leave you all with that, and hopefully folks can kind of keep that image of who the heroes in their lives are, who's making them feel safe, what's making them feel safe as we go through this presentation. So I'm going to turn it back to the moderator, and I'll put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out if you want to talk about anything. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Palika. That was really, really great. And I think it helped give us a real grounding to what propaganda is, how we can recognize it, and appreciate, of course, always the idea of reframing when we're communicating. I think maybe Jennifer has a question. We're going to try to hold questions from the whole group till the end, but we wanted to maybe, a question occurred to Jen that I thought was really great while you were talking. So you want to ask the question, Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you for that amazing presentation. One of the things I was thinking about is, I know what I would do if I encounter propaganda and how to not participate in it. What do I do when it's family members who might not share the same principles? What if my brother invites me to watch Brooklyn 99 with him, or my aunt wants to sit down and watch NCIS together? What do I do in that situation?
That's a great question. The question around family and how to deal with family when it comes to things like that is really difficult. And I think that acknowledging the kind of like intention behind wanting to share, because it happened to me too. I had my parents that were sharing videos of protesters and cops hugging and praying together. And I think it was important for me to acknowledge the intention there, and like acknowledge that need for hope and positivity. And start from there, and then kind of dive into the facts a little bit more. When it comes to TV shows, I mean, I think the last time I visited my great aunt, and she still watches like cable television, and I just like, you flip through and it's the number of prosecutor shows, the number of cop shows is just completely alarming. And what I found really helpful was taking bits and pieces. I mean, because I work in this field, it's nice to have some like actual real life anecdotes to share with her. But I remember something that really struck a chord with her was that she would tell me how SVU, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the lead main female character's name, Mariska Hargitay, is that her name? Yes, she was telling me that she watched an interview with her where Mariska Hargitay, sorry for any fans out there who I'm just butchering her name. She talked about how like fans of the show would come up to her in the street and thank her for, helping show victims in a certain light, helping, give them ideas for what they should do if they do encounter violence, or they do encounter domestic violence, sexual violence, etc., which is of course incredible. So we started with that point, and I instead, not to invalidate that, but to share as a counterpoint, I shared like some real data about how many of those types of crimes actually go solved, or actually like, creating situations where people are cared for. And especially in the death penalty work that I do, we work a lot with victim groups. We organize a lot of victims groups who really lead the fight in explaining that all of that money that goes towards killing a person in their state, they see none of that. They don't get anything from that. They would much rather have money towards trauma counseling, towards, some sort of like stipend for their family for what they've been through, legal bills being paid, things like that. So I feel like there's a few main talking points, and the color change report has a few good ones that people can use to share. But I think that what's important is just really starting with like acknowledging why people want to watch this, acknowledging why people want to share these videos, because there's some like real human emotion there. And it's valid. I hope that's helpful.
That was really helpful. Thank you. As a reminder, we will be doing Q&A with all of our speakers at the end. So if you think of a question for Palika or for any of our speakers, go ahead and drop it straight into the chat, and we'll be able to look at those when we get to the end of the speakers. For now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Alec Karakatsanis. Alec is the founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps. Before founding Civil Rights Corps, Alec was a civil rights lawyer and public defender, a federal public defender, and co-founder of the nonprofit organization Equal Justice Under Law. Alec lectures widely about the failures of the criminal punishment bureaucracy. He typically gives over 100 speeches, trainings, interviews, and workshops every year. So we're very lucky to be one of those over 100 tonight. And most recently, he is the author of the book Usual Cruelty. He also writes a regular newsletter on Copaganda in the media, and that's called Alec's Copaganda Newsletter. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Alec.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me okay? I appreciate this space so much, and I hope to engage in a little discussion with you all after I talk. I'm just going to say a few things about the kinds of propaganda narratives that I'm tracking and that I see as most prevalent and most dangerous and harmful. And then maybe talk a little bit about how and why those narratives exist and what we might be able to do about them. I think there's really three main narratives that I see over and over again as kind of pervasive themes of a lot of the media coverage of the criminal punishment bureaucracy and of the concept of public safety more generally. The first narrative theme, and by the way, when I say narrative theme, I don't just mean the content of news coverage. I also mean decisions about what to write about and what to ignore. I also mean decisions about what counts as news in the first place, right? Not just who is quoted in the article and what they're saying, but also the very notion of what is important enough to tell people about, right? What counts as something that takes up discrete space in a newspaper or a short nightly news broadcast. So I think the first narrative that I see kind of pervasively in all of the work that I track is an idea that public safety is a narrow concept that is most prominently defined by the kinds of crimes that poor people commit. So the first sort of narrative theme that I notice a lot is a constraining of our conception of what it means to be safe. And it doesn't include things like water pollution or air pollution or illegal eviction or workplace safety violations, building code violations. It doesn't include traffic safety, right? Even though each of those things I just mentioned actually kills more people than all murder combined in the country, right? And so if we're thinking actually about the determinants of what creates safe and healthy communities, what actually determines people's well-being, it's actually not the things that the news talks about in terms of, you know, so-called public safety. So one of the, I think, main narratives of propaganda is relentlessly trying to get people to constrain their notion of safety. Now, why are they doing it? I think one of the main, and how is it being accomplished? I think one of the main reasons is that it benefits a lot of powerful people, wealthy people, people who own things in our society, to be narrowly focused as an urgent matter on the legal violations of the poor. It also benefits police and all of the people who benefit from the criminal punishment bureaucracy to focus on the very narrow range of harms that police themselves track. So that's, I think, one of the reasons that you see police departments spending so much money and time on press releases, on interviews with the media, on social media, on strategic consultants, on shaping the nightly news broadcast every single night, so that every single night, if you turn on the local news in virtually any city in this country, you will see crime story after crime story after crime story. And also you'll see police as sources for a lot of those stories. What you won't see are anecdotes about all of the poor people who were illegally evicted from their homes that day, or all of the companies that dump chemicals in the water that poison children, rot their teeth, and give kidney failure, nerve damage, and cancer. What you won't see are the companies that spew air pollution illegally, violating criminal laws in terms of illegal chemical dumping, et cetera. Air pollution kills 100,000 people a year in this country alone and 10 million people around the world, right? But it's not treated as an urgent event on the nightly news. Those are the things that are criminal, but you also don't see coverage of much broader harm. All of the people who pass away because they lack access to medical care, or they lack enough food or clothing or shelter for their children. Those are deep structural issues in our society. And one of the many reasons that people don't treat those problems at the level of urgency that they demand is the media does not treat them at the level of urgency they demand. There are not nightly news stories getting us worked up and afraid about those things every night, just like there is shoplifting. And that's a decision the media is making to lift up certain kinds of narratives over others. The second theme that I notice a lot, and the second narrative that I think, you know, is worth talking about here tonight, is the extent to which, having constrained our very understanding of what safety is, the news media is constantly telling us this narrative that it's going up. And for the last 25 or 30 years, they've done these polls, and people constantly think every single year, but for 1 or 2 years, people have said that crime is going up. These narrow range of police reported crimes are increasing. And every single year, except for 1 or 2 years in the last 30 years, crime has been going down. And how do we get to a point where the vast majority of the public is misled to the point where they are thinking the opposite about the crime trends that the media is reporting? And I think that is evidence of how powerful this media narrative is, that crime is always increasing. Now, why is that narrative so prevalent? Well, a lot of the people who benefit from systems of control and surveillance and profit, right? They have an interest in making people afraid. And not just making people afraid, because they're not trying to make people afraid of climate change or landlords, right? They want people to be afraid of poor people. And they want people to be afraid of houseless people. And they want people to be afraid of immigrants. They want people to be afraid of Black people. They want people to be afraid of marginalized groups in our society. And so when people are afraid, they're easier to control, easier to manipulate, and they're more likely to support authoritarian kind of right-wing systems of surveillance and control. And those systems are very profitable and they benefit a small number of people who also have a lot of political power in this country. So I think that's one of the main reasons why you see the media making it seem like crime is increasing all the time, because it benefits people. And you see now in these even these midterm elections, there is a concerted effort among far right media outlets and far right pundits and a lot of, frankly, the corporate mainstream media, the concerted effort to make people think that US cities are somehow less safe than ever and crime is out of control. And it goes along with this narrative that they're sort of blaming the defund movement, even though police budgets and jail budgets and prison budgets are higher than they've ever been. So there's never any significant defunding in any place in this country. So that sort of, I think, ties into the third narrative that I wanted to talk about, which I think is in some respects the most important. The third narrative is having constrained our conception of safety and having gotten us to think that narrow understanding of safety is constantly an ever-increasing threat. The media propaganda machine wants us to think that the solution to that problem is more investment in carceral bureaucracy. Okay, so it's, as you can probably tell by now, it's framing all of the wrong questions so that it can give us the wrong answers. And I think most prominent examples that you've probably seen in the news recently are a lot of places around the country are blaming so-called bail reform for a rise in crime or blaming defund. There's been a bunch of articles in a bunch of different cities actually about how the rise in crime, supposed rise in crime. Now, keep in mind, in many of those cities, crime is actually down, but the supposed rise in crime is related to a court backlog, too many old cases. All of these are part and parcel, and over the last 5 years, we've seen similar ideas. For example, every time there's been a California passed Prop 47, which did a bunch of things to sort of reduce the severity of certain punishments, it converted a bunch of felonies to misdemeanors, et cetera, for so-called nonviolent property crimes. And when that happened, there was a huge backlash in the right-wing media and corporate media suggesting that reducing punishment and sentencing actually increases crime. So what these things all have in common is they suggest falsely to the public that the little policy tweaks that punishment bureaucrats are engaging in, charging decisions by prosecutors, patrol decisions by police officers, bail decisions by judges, sentencing decisions by prosecutors and judges, that those things somehow correlate with lower or increased crime. That is like climate science denial. What we know from the actual scientific evidence is that the root causes of harm and crime in our society, the root causes of interpersonal violence, are bigger structural features of our society. There are things like inequality, poverty, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to therapy, lack of access for children to school, theater, music, art programs, after school programming, quality education. In large part, lack of investment in early childhood education, in things like lead poisoning in children. These are all things that we know from scientific evidence are dramatically more associated with people avoiding contact with the criminal system. And then there's also sort of bigger cultural things, right? There's things like toxic masculinity, right? A huge driver of gender-based violence, sexual violence, and many other forms of interpersonal harm. These are not things that can be solved by little policy tweaks by government bureaucrats. They want us to think that little tiny policy tweaks by government bureaucrats, or even big policy tweaks by government bureaucrats, are correlated with so-called crime because they don't want to address these underlying structural root causes in our society. And that is a very important narrative of propaganda, constantly getting us to think that the solutions to these problems are things that people in power can do through more investments in government bureaucracy. And I think that, for me, is maybe the most insidious, because it's also one of the hardest forms of propaganda to spot. And it kind of happens every single article about a murder or a shooting or shoplifting. They just immediately start quoting the police. they frame so-called violent crime as something that is within the ambit of the police, that the police have something to do with, etc. When in fact, every one of those stories could just as easily be a story about poverty or alienation or lack of access to the basic necessities of life, or any number of other things that we know are far more associated with violent crime. So I think for me, one of the things that we need to do is deepen our understanding and our commitment of the scientific literature, and studying together, struggling together to organize is extremely important, around the same way that there was a concerted and years-long effort to combat climate propaganda. We need to build in every community reading groups, study groups, with our fellow organizers, with our fellow congregation members, etc. Depending on who your community is, start reading and identifying these things, being really clear on what the evidence actually is, and then educating our communities about it, because there's a relentless nature of these narratives are all around us. Everyone was in the last the discussion at the end of Palika's presentation, everyone was sort of, I think, thinking a little bit about Law and Order and some of the fictional shows that pervade television, but these narratives are pervasive in so-called real news as well. And when you're in an environment culturally where you're being constantly bombarded with propaganda at all times, it's really important to create these spaces together in our own communities where we can kind of like, clean our minds of that propaganda, and we're sort of like relearn what we all know, which is that people are healthier, safer, happier, more able to flourish when they're getting the basic things that they need for themselves and their families. And a lot of time and money is spent on getting us to unlearn that basic truth, on getting us to invest in bureaucracies of pain and punishment rather than systems of care. And so one of the reasons I started writing my Copaganda newsletter and doing events like this and talking about this is trying to help people develop and build some of the resources that they can use to share with each other and their communities, to more critically confront the way that a lot of the media is talking about these issues. And luckily, there's a lot of incredible organizers that I work with all over the country who are doing this in their own communities every single day. And it's really inspiring to be a part of the movement in this time when they're, I think, developing really critical perspective on the criminal punishment bureaucracy that didn't really exist, at least that I'm aware of, I think 15 years ago when I started my career as a lawyer. It was really hard to find communities that were studying together and working on these issues together. And now we've got a proliferation of mutual aid groups, court watching groups, all kinds of people who are learning and growing into abolitionist thinkers. And it's really exciting time, I think. So it feels really bleak in the sense of how powerful and dominant the corporate media is, but it's also a very exciting time, I think, for many of us who are thinking about these issues together. It feels different to me than it did 15 years ago. And it feels like there are all kinds of groups and communities across the country that are building this knowledge together through studying and struggling together. And so that is maybe a positive thing that I can leave you on. And I'm looking forward to talking more about this at the question and answer period at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, Alec, so much there. And I want to invite you to drop into the chat where people can sign up for your newsletter, your Copaganda newsletter, which I recently just did. It's really great. And yeah, I don't know, Jennifer, did you have a question that you wanted to ask, or how are we doing on time?
We've got 5 minutes if we want to do one question.
Go for it. You had a good
Yeah.
question, I think. She's
Yeah, okay, all
always
right.
thinking, Jennifer.
Sure. Okay, yeah. And again, for everyone, as you think of questions, drop them into the chat and we will grab them and bring them up either after the speaker or at the Q&A for everyone. So one question I had for Alec was, is there anything that we as individuals can be doing to encourage the change that we need? How do we as individuals set expectations for hearing the real news stories that need to be told instead?
Well, I think that very little can be done as individuals. I think all good things are done in community with others, and that's what makes organizing so vital. So I would urge everyone to not try to like tackle any of these problems by themselves. They are daunting, they're huge, they're incredibly disturbing problems that are really difficult to, and it can feel really lonely when you're trying to confront these things on your own. But I think getting together with other people in whatever form that takes, whether it's just reading together and talking together about these ideas, or getting together and working on something in your own community, working on a campaign, it's absolutely vital. I think that's how you learn, in my experience at least, that's how people learn in a deeper way. But I will say, as individuals, I think we're all responsible to some degree for cultivating our own mind and building our own critical thinking skills, and being really intentional with how we spend our time in a world with so much suffering, and in a world with such organized adversaries on the right. So we have to, and I think it's very important that you put the time in to learn about how these systems are functioning, to learn about how social movements are fighting them, to learn about how social movements in the past have fought against propaganda and dominant narrative. And it's really important to do that intellectual work on your own as well. Put the time in to really understand propaganda, to really understand how other social movements in the past have fought against it. And I think that's like a really critical thing for us to do. But I would put the time in on your own, but I would do it as part of a community. And I think that's a really key point.
Thank you so much, Alec. And I have to say, you just gave us an advertisement, because we're trying to do that here at AFSC. So thanks. I know there's people probably can do this at the local level too, but want to just, give ourselves a plug that we have. And I see some folks here. It's great to see folks from the Building Community Alternatives group that we just did in the spring. And we just had another study cohort around restorative justice, but we are trying to create spaces for people to learn some of these things together, struggle with them, and then do organizing in their own communities as part of that. So stay tuned. We're going to be doing some more in the spring. Really appreciate that, Alec. I'm glad you dropped your Substack in the chat. Now we just I'm really excited to introduce my dear colleague, Tori Bateman, who's here with us today. She's a policy advocacy coordinator for Just Peace, which is an area of work within AFSC in our Office of Public Policy and Advocacy. And she advocates for policy that aligns with AFSC's vision of peace and healing justice. And I think Jennifer's going to share her screen for you. Is that right? And so take it away, Tori. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Tori, as Mary said, and I work as a policy advocacy coordinator with the American Friends Service Committee. My role here is advocating on our Just Peace portfolio, which covers everything from Pentagon spending to policing. So issues like Copaganda really come up a lot when I am working in political spaces around policing and the federal budget and resources that our communities are putting into police departments. Palika and I did not plan this, but I have some very similar questions to what she started us out with to mull over around what do politicians keep us safe, and which policies actually keep us safe. We thought earlier this evening around how when we have felt the most safe, what's around us, what we experience. And I want you all to take a moment and think through campaign ads you've seen or speeches you've heard from local political leaders when they are talking about safety. What do they mean by that? What are the policies that they want to put into place as a result of what they're talking about? And then when you think about, getting to that safe place that Palika had us thinking about, what policies would help you get there more often? So I just want to give us a couple moments to think that through. If you have thoughts that come to mind, please feel free to put them in the chat and share them with the group. At least in my own TV watching experience and watching of campaign ads, I see a lot of police these days, a lot of fund the police rhetoric when we're talking about safety. And when I think about which policies would actually keep me safe, I think a lot more about traffic, honestly. I think the thing that keeps me least safe in my own community is the crosswalks that get ignored by cars. So that's one of the things that, I think of when I think of the differences between what politicians are saying will keep us safe and what actually would. So please, as you think through that over the next few minutes, feel free to put your thoughts in the chats. I see, clean air and water, access to healthcare as policies that would keep folks safe. So, to start out this conversation around propaganda and politics today, I'm going to start with something very similar to what Alec was saying earlier, which is that humans have the right to feel safety, and it's really important that folks feel secure and have the resources they need to survive. But one of the really big successes that propaganda narratives have had is that they've limited what we think of as safety, what we think solutions should look like. We know that safety really means having stable housing, and yet so many people in the US don't have that. We know everyone needs food. We know that we need clean drinking water, economic opportunity, access to education, healthcare. And these are things that millions of Americans do not have, and that impacts their safety every single day. And yet those are not the things that come to mind when we think about politicians talking about safety and what solutions those politicians are proposing when they talk about safety. Instead, safety in popular culture and in mainstream media often revolves more around militarized police forces. It looks like control exerted over communities by the government. And unfortunately, Congress, the president, local political bodies, they're all susceptible to propaganda narratives that we've been hearing about. They are also impacted in elections by these narratives as they circulate. And they're also complicit in producing some of this propaganda themselves. So that's all I'm going to be talking about in my conversation today. You can go to the next slide. So, law and order rhetoric in politics is certainly nothing new. Trump has used it, Nixon used it, Clinton used it. The idea that, there's disorder everywhere, chaos, and only a new political leader is going to bring in the rule of law and safety for everyone has been used really regularly throughout the history of the United States in campaigns and in political rhetoric. And this is in part because, as Alex also noted, fear-based messaging is really effective, playing on people's emotions. And people do have that legitimate concern that they want to feel safe in their communities. And people capitalize on this in order to stoke fear and impact elections. They want to impact elections. They want to impact policy outcomes. They want to put funds into their chosen programming, whether that's because they run that program or because they profit off of that program. And we know that there's a lot of things that are essential to keeping people safe, from stable housing that I mentioned and economic opportunity, that don't get included in that narrative. That is the fear-based safety narrative. It's a political conversation that's really focused on an inadequate definition of safety that gives us a really limited toolbox to create that safety with. And you can go to the next slide. And this narrative that propaganda has given us really has an impact on how candidates for office present themselves and how they compete for votes. It's super evident. I don't know if anyone has turned on a TV over the last month or so, or opened up a web page with any news on it whatsoever. But you'll hear a ton about increased crime, police-based solutions in the media coverage of the midterm elections. And this is also something that the parties themselves are really choosing to talk about as a policy issue. They're both echoing propaganda talking points. They're proposing police-based solutions. And then they're also producing a ton of media content alongside police forces as they go about their campaigns. So here on the slide that you have in front of you, I have a messaging guide that House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy put out recently for Republican candidates. And it shows politicians actively encouraging the creation of Copaganda before the election. Their framing of the issue uses exactly that limited sense of safety that we talked about earlier, calling out killings of law enforcement without any mention of police violence. They suggest criminalization of fentanyl analogs as a solution for overdoses with no mention of public health supports for folks. And what's more, there to the right, you'll see that they put out a field guide. This is essentially recommendations for members of Congress on how they can set up media opportunities in district. So things like dropping by a local police precinct to say thank you, coordinating roundtables to hear what the police want, and even organizing a ride along with police officers, which is when somebody will get in the side of the police car and go along as they go through their daily activities. And this is a really easy example to bring because it's straight up talking points that the Republicans put out for the election. But I really do not want to give the impression that this is just a Republican problem by any means. If you can go to the next slide. The Democrats also had a memo that was leaked that showed the same sort of tips on how to push back on defund the police narratives. And they've very much leaned into these suggestions. Here are on this next slide, 2 photos of, the same slide we were just on. Yeah. 2 photos of moderate Democrats that are leaning into these Copaganda producing opportunities. On the left-hand side, you have Representative Gottheimer. At an August event, he's standing in front of a whole bunch of police celebrating funding that the district got through the COPS grant program, which is essentially federal money that gets sent to local police departments. He's celebrating the 1033 program, which is how military surplus goods get into the hands of local police departments. And then the other image there to the right is one of those police ride-alongs that we were just talking about. That's Representative Spanberger, who basically did a photo shoot with a police department for a day. There's a whole bunch more where this one came from of her hanging out with the police department, really high quality photos that ended up all over the media in the days following that visit. So neither of these were official campaign events to my knowledge, but as anyone who follows politics will tell you, anything a member does in the year leading up to an election, which this year was, the election is absolutely in the back of their minds. Not a vote is taken, not a letter is signed, not a photo shoot is done without thoughts on how this is going to impact their electability. And you can go to the next slide for me. Because Copaganda does have an impact on voter behavior. The candidates use pro-police messages and that fear-based messaging on crime. There's some recent polling out of New York that showed 28% of voters listed crime as the most urgent issue facing the state. And a lot of that is coming from this fear-based messaging and attacks that are coming from political leaders seeking to capitalize on that sort of fear in the coming election cycle. So obviously all of this does end up having an impact on policymaking itself. It's not just what photos get out there. It's not just how people feel about police, and it's not just who wins elections. It's also what is proposed as policies, both from the administration. It includes how members of Congress talk to each other about policies, and it impacts what gets a vote and what gets out of each chamber. Here on the slide, you'll see 2 presidential examples. The first example is the Biden budget request, which essentially lays out the priorities that the administration has for funding in the next year. And in this budget for fiscal year 2023, which is currently being negotiated, he calls for, this is a quote, funding the police, including by putting more police officers on the beat. And then he accompanies that call with a request for an increase of 12% in federal funds for state and local law enforcement. And then the example to the right is Biden's Safer America plan, which he essentially used to outline his priorities around public safety. And in it, he talks about $10 billion that was in the American Rescue Plan that ended up going into policing and community safety. and restates the fact that he wants more money for policing in fiscal year 2023. So it impacts what the president is saying, because he's, aware of the policing propaganda narratives that are out there and how that's impacting the voting population. And it also impacts Congress. You can go to the next slide for me. In the middle of all of this midterm election pressure, they've also caved and voted on policing legislation, including the Invest to Protect Act, which was just brought up last month, which authorized grants to local police departments for hiring and training more police officers. And you can imagine this was very strategically voted on when it was voted on in order to give those candidates a pro-police talking point for the election. And one more slide. And I have tried to focus mostly on national examples here, because I know we have folks from all over the country on the call tonight. But I also wanted to show one more local government example of how these narratives appear. And this is from my own home city, Washington, D.C., in the primary fight for the mayor's office. Our mayor, Muriel Bowser, and her campaign used policing talking points really heavily. I actually got a flyer from her campaign that essentially said, hire more female cops. It's not the one pictured here. It was another one that I had gotten. This one here says that she keeps her promises by adding more women as police. And the attack postcard there on the left says that her opponent, Robert White, will voted to decrease DC police funding, even school resource officers. And these things were backed up by her eventual budget proposals, policy decisions, which you can see there, an article highlighting her effort to get us up to 4,000 MPD officers. You can go to the next slide. So amidst all of this horrible impact of propaganda on legislation and our political system, is there any good legislation that we can support? The answer is yes. There is a lot of legislation out there that's been proposed that does use this more expansive definition of safety that we'd like to see, and seeks to invest in things like non-carceral crisis response, community violence intervention, social supports, education, and all the other stuff that would actually keep us safe rather than policing. Two of those things that I'll highlight now, one of them is the People's Response Act, which is part of the Movement for Black Lives Breathe platform, which is fantastic. You all should check it out, check out their website if you haven't gotten a chance to look at it. But this People's Response Act bill in particular would create a dedicated community safety agency at Health and Human Services, and it would get grant money into community-based organizations for things like non-carceral first responders, supportive housing, restorative justice, violence interruption, infrastructure, all sorts of things. That is standalone legislation, which is really tricky to get through Congress in the best of times, and now is not necessarily the easiest or best of times for this sort of legislation to get through at all. So another thing that I note as a possibility for supporting is the budget process. The budget is something that theoretically needs to get passed every year, and it provides the resources for both good and bad programming. So it's really important to engage in it as a way to have a say in how taxpayer dollars are spent. Specifically right now, we have at AFSC an online action up that calls for Congress to move money out of things like federal policing, grants to local police departments, and into things like non-carceral violence response, education, all those other things that the People's Response Act was also calling for. So we'll put that in the chat for folks to check out. But there are some bright spots in legislative efforts happening, despite the prevalence of propaganda, both influencing and produced by members of Congress.
Excellent. I wasn't sure if you were going to another slide. You're sorry about that. Thank you so much, Tori. Yeah, I mean, we see the tangible results of the propaganda that we've been outlining, right? It has an effect on the policies that that shape our communities. And I appreciate seeing some of the people in the chat. Cullen, it's great to see you here. We both posted about the purge rumors or the sort of messaging the Republicans are putting through in Illinois because of our Safety Act, which is an incredible victory. I think that we've got a lot of questions from our people, and we'll open up to everybody. But I see a question that Rachel put in the chat that I think would be really great for Tori to address, which is there anything we can do to encourage candidates not to reflexively take a narrow view of public safety when in the short term it polls well? Have any thoughts about that, Tori?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is just as constituents being really vocal about your understanding of what safety is to your legislators, whether they're at the local level or the federal level. I think, a lot of this narrative that they're pushing does come from a sense that that's what their constituents want them to say. They have a lot of fear about, their own electability and what their constituents think of them. So being loud, organizing in your own communities, ways to push back against police narratives and make it really clear that when you talk about safety, like these are the things you mean. It's not policing, it's not militarized police forces, it's education, it's healthcare, whatever else you're passionate about, and just making sure that those things get framed in a way that makes it clear that there's safety.
Thanks, Tori. That's really, really helpful. And I keep hearing all of our speakers talk about collective action, like that we need to be working together in all of these different spheres. Cullen, thanks for posting more info on the purge and that whole discussion going on in Illinois. Oren says, when you talk to those candidates, keep your frame of discussion on true safety for the quality of life. Yeah, great talking points. If people have more questions, pop them in the chat. I've got a couple myself. I think there may be some media makers in the room tonight. I'm kind of curious, Alec, if you have any. I know you come from a law background, but you do have your own platform with your newsletter and whatnot. But I wonder if you have advice for like, what if there are people who are involved in the news media and they're, shaped by bigger forces? How do people try to create space to tell these alternative stories in your view? Do you have some thoughts about that? What if you're working for the Chicago Tribune and you're trying to have a good take on this Safety Act? How do you find space in those institutions to try to tell better stories?
This is a really important question, and I actually end up working a lot with journalists across the country in major outlets, in local outlets. And I think one really important thing, first of all, is the police make it really easy to tell their version of events. They send you all the press conferences, they send you to all the stories they want, they package them, they give you the right video, they give it edited, right? They make it really easy to get on the nightly news. So one thing we need to do is all the sort of stories that we want told, whether they're sort of holistic public safety stories, whether they're stories about things that we need in our schools, things that we need in our communities in terms of healthcare, housing, et cetera. We need to make sure that those people are building relationships with journalists so that it makes it very easy to tell those stories. We need to make sure that journalists have someone. One thing I've been trying to get journalists to do, for example, is build relationships with people who are fighting against wage theft. People who are local regulators who monitor air quality and water pollution, et cetera, right? And if those people don't have PR departments like police departments do, but they're constantly every day learning things about public safety that would be very important for the public to know. Also, I've been trying to get journalists to build longer term relationships with local principals, teachers, nurses, home health care workers, restaurant workers, unions, et cetera. All these different people who have access to stories about public safety, who have access to stories about things that they're building in their communities. So we've been connecting journalists to directly impacted people and formerly incarcerated people who have loved ones inside jails and prisons right now. I've been connecting journalists to people inside local jails, been connecting journalists to people who run mutual aid networks, and convincing some of those people that part of the work that they're doing is building connections with journalists so that maybe the first time they have this connection, they end up being the person in the article, like after 3 quotes by the police, there's something that says like, critics say this, but the second and the third time, they're actually the person that's helping to shape the article. It was their idea to cover a certain story. And once you build relationships with journalists, they really appreciate having sources. They want people to bring them things. And then the next thing that we do with people is we help them figure out how to package things so that they are good pitches for journalists and they're easy for journalists to run with. So how do you create media content that actually journalists don't have to do much work to produce, to reproduce? It's kind of like many local news stories in the nightly news are literally just reading police press releases. Well, let's bombard those nightly news. They're constantly looking for content. They have to fill 24-minute segments twice a night in many cities, right? 6 o'clock p.m., 11 o'clock news. Sometimes if you just give them stuff, then they'll actually put it on the air. And so, those are some ideas. And then one other thing I've been working with journalists on as well is what I think of as like political education for journalists. How do we get them to actually understand how these systems are functioning, why some of what they're doing is problematic? And so I've been giving them, along with some of my colleagues, resources that help them understand the bail system, help them understand the social determinants of safety. So anytime a journalist wants to write an article on bail in Cleveland or Dallas and Phoenix, they have a handout and a tip sheet from us that has all the actual statistics and data and a list of suggested sources that they can interview in their area. Those are just some ideas that we've been working on, and I think there's different ways of going about it though.
Oh, that's great. And actually, so many great examples that any of us who are working in organizations can do to try to build relationships and give better information to the journalists who are working in our communities. But Cullen and I seem to have like a mind meld tonight. He kind of asked a question that was similar, but it's slightly different. I want to address it to Palika, because you've done so much training with folks around the world on sort of becoming media makers and telling their stories. And Cullen's asking about how we leverage movement media to counter the corporate right-wing media and those larger platforms. I would just wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and also tell us about your work in communities, kind of training people to tell their stories.
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm going to close my door because it's a little loud. Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I guess there's kind of 2 parts here. One, there are a lot of incredible like community journalists and community publications that are covering like local beats, like, the Chinese neighborhood, the African beat, the, specific neighborhoods within New York City. All of those journalists always have their DMs open, are always available on Twitter, always down to collaborate, similar to what Alec was saying. But then in terms of people, like everyday people who are going out and filming, I think the question around like, yes, it's one thing to actually film your footage. It's one thing to actually share the footage and make sure that people see it. And that's the more difficult part for certain. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to work with a lawyer or work with a journalist, DM someone, bring some like credibility and validity to your footage, so that when it's shared, you can decide if you want your name associated with it, or do you just want it like pushed out through the local publication because you don't want that, a backlash to be on you. We've seen how that's happened with some pretty high profile police filming, like with Eric Garner, for example. So there's lots of, I actually have like a tip sheet that I can share in the chat with steps that people can take to protect their safety and to make sure that their footage, once they've filmed it, if they have filmed police misconduct, is reaching the right people. I can actually share that in the chat. It just like has some kind of basic steps and ideas of like who you can reach out to, how you can reach out to them, what you should be thinking about with your own digital safety and security. What are like small things you can do to make sure that your footage is more verifiable, that it can be validated, things like that. I don't know if that was quite the question, but
yeah, no, I think that's all really helpful. And yeah, and people should kind of know their rights in their local jurisdiction around filming the police, et cetera. That piece is good too. But yeah, I think all those all those things are really important. And I don't know, I'm just curious if Cullen, if you have thoughts about leveraging movement media, I know you're involved in it. You could unmute, but you don't have to. But if you feel like raising your hand and letting us know, somebody will let us know that you might want to share some thoughts about that. Okay, not able to, that's fine. I want to again invite people to pop other questions in there. I've got another one queued up, but I wanted to ask Tori something about, again, how do we all become involved? You were talking about more directly how we discuss these ideas with our legislators. How do people, tell us your experience about how do people telling their personal stories or telling stories from their communities, what kind of an impact? I mean, I know I've been involved with doing those things. Sometimes it feels like, great, I had this meeting with a staffer, blah, 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 but what actually comes with it? But can you share with us, like, because you take people around all the time, like, what do you see, what kind of impact do you see when people share their stories?
You caught me with that question at a great time, because I was just in a conversation with a former staffer earlier today, who hopefully won't see this, but they were a former staffer with a legislator that I often took constituents to, who were deeply impacted by some of the policy issues that they were working on. Consistently took their stories, even it was hardly traumatic stories that they kept having to share with legislators. And this person told me that the fact that they kept coming back, kept really pushing on it, didn't let them give them no answers, did get them on letters and legislation that they wouldn't have gotten on before. So the impact is that it gives your legislator no choice but to either make you as a constituent really mad, or make some moves towards the policy change you want to see. That's not always going to happen, but there is instances of constituent conversations with legislators and staff making a big difference, and it's always worth trying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you can get two for the price of one, right? Because if you're creating media, for your community to help people understand the issue, you can also, I've gone and shared short videos when I've met with my legislator, you can do that too. All right, I've got another question here. Hang on a second. Okay, this could go, anybody who wants to answer this one. We all learn things for the first time at some point. How can we help people who are in that state? What have any of you found most effective in introducing someone, especially someone who thinks of themselves as progressive, to the concept of Copaganda for the first time? Any thoughts about that? I think you can invite them to watch this webinar. That's what I would suggest, the recording of this webinar. Is there a resource that any of you know, like off the bat, that would be a good, actually, I think Palika's, you did an explainer in Teen Vogue, which is actually, I wonder if we could pop, Jennifer, maybe you could find that and pop that into the chat. I thought that was excellent. I'm going to look back because Rachel asked a question earlier that was really interesting about mutual aid. Let me go back and find it. Jennifer, do you see that? Okay, here we go. Rachel was asking, their local police department uses the term mutual aid to refer not to neighbors helping each other meet material needs, but nearby law enforcement coming to help break up protests. Whoa. And looking for an alternative term for that. So you're looking for an alternative term for what law enforcement is actually doing? That's a really tricky one. It seems like you could make a really good campaign around, like, what is mutual aid actually? What does it actually look like? That's really crazy. Anybody have thoughts about that one?
It just sounds like it's policing, but my campaign, my like digital tactic campaign brain turns on, and it's like I could see people flooding that local precinct's Twitter with images of actual like what mutual aid looks like, or, you know, getting members in the community to, you know, do some sort of like call to action around that. That would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you could both promote actual mutual aid and debunk this other. And yeah, and Joan just asked, what do you do when words get taken and rebranded, which is exactly what they're doing. I think, yeah, calling it out, take the brand back, take the term back. That's really, really helpful. Yeah, okay, any last questions or any last thoughts that any of you would like to share with us? If not, maybe I'll invite Jennifer. Can you pop up our last slide and we can do a little closeout? It's been great talking with all of you, and I do hope we're going to send out the recording. We will send out the recording early next week, and then we will also send out a resource page with some of the links that have been put into the chat. And Palika, Tori, Alec, I also invite you, if there's other resources that you want to email me, I can include that in our resource sheet. And then, yeah, again, I just wanted to, you know, just remind folks that if you go to AFSC's website and /CSBP, that is our Community Safety Beyond Policing page, and we've got all of our past webinars. It's just a ton of material in there. Great speakers from across the country, people who are working at the grassroots, academics, thinkers, all kinds of practitioners in conversation about these issues. So check that out. And in 2023, we're going to be launching 3 more study groups. So we'll be able to dig deeply into some topics together. So stay tuned for that. And then I also want to invite people, AFSC's healing justice work broadly, which includes, we're just really working for a world beyond not only policing, but surveillance and prisons as well. And we have a vision document that's also listed there, afsc.org/Northstar. That's our vision document where all of our work is being organized around these principles. And we invite you to take a look at that as well. And yeah, I'm just super grateful for everybody's time tonight. It was great to meet you, both Alec and Palika. I hope we can continue the conversation down the road. And thanks again to Tori. Always great to hear your perspective on these things. And Jennifer, thank you so much. Want to give the last shout out, Jen? Say goodnight.
No, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Big thank you to our speakers, and also to everyone who stayed around and watched and asked questions. And for those of you who had to drop early, check out our website, afsc.org/CSBP. That's Community Safety Beyond Policing. It's the video from tonight will be up there, and also all of our past videos are there as well.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Summer and everybody. And till soon. Take care, everybody.